Parenthetically, this morning as I start, I'm thankful for a pastor who is willing to stand. I'm very thankful for a pastor that is willing to stand for the things of Jesus Christ. In a day when it's easier to float downstream, he's willing to swim up, and I'm thankful for that. I'd like to share very briefly this morning this great truth that has been suspended on what we call the Liberty Bell, originally the state bell of Pennsylvania. Some of us know the inscription there taken from Leviticus 25:10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. There are probably a few icons in our heritage that would help us to appreciate and remember the liberties that we enjoy, but this certainly is one of the most important of those icons. This morning, just as I begin, I want to call your attention to a very important aspect, an important work that I trust will be helpful to some of us who are seeking to respond to where we are as a nation. We're seeking to respond to what is happening in our nation. I would like to suggest this text, this book to you, Debunking Zinn. I would assume that some of us are familiar with this, but it is written by Mary Graber. And I encourage you, Grandma and Grandpa, Mom and Dad, if you have some youth that are struggling, she's going to answer a number of the issues that the world around us, Marxism and so forth, in our nation has been raising throughout the 20th century and here into the first quarter of the 21st century. I want to recommend that to you this morning, and trust that if you're needing some answers, certainly I in no way am going to provide everything that you need this morning as you move forward seeking to answer the questions that you face. But I'd like to simply throw that out to you this morning. A number of years ago, before my wife Beth and I moved to Tennessee, I made an appointment with a friend, Judge Charles Pickering. We met at a restaurant in Flowood, Mississippi. As we met there, I looked across the table at Judge Pickering as I was attempting to say goodbye to him, and he recounted to me how that in recent years he had undergone some thoughts concerning the future. He was deeply concerned about the kind of America that his grandchildren were going to have to grow up in. And then he went on to explain that he was even now more deeply concerned about the kind of America that his children were going to have to live through. And then he said, I've become even more concerned about the fact that I'm going to have to live in an America that is very different from what we one time knew. It just isn't succeeding generations anymore, it is our generation. And that's exactly what Judge Pickering was trying to tell me. Judge Pickering had been selected by George W. Bush to assist him in the judiciary as a federal judge. And after the attacks by Patrick Leahy and other liberals, he withdrew his name. I knew Judge Pickering and am thankful for individuals like this that will stand for what is right as God gives them the liberty to do so. I'd like to call your attention to the fact that indeed we're fighting slavery as our founding fathers in America for 13 years, from 1763 to 1776. They fought against, in their own words, was slavery, the enslavement of the colonies, the American colonies, by the Parliament and by King George III. They vigorously strove against this as they initially began to discuss and seek to find ways around the oppression that was increasing on the colonies. Finally, you know the rest of the story. it ended in war. And I'm mindful today that there are two forms of religion that which create tyranny in the world. The one is irreligion, and the other wrong religion. There is truth, and I know that time has told us that we live in a post-truth society, but I trust in our hearts we will cling tenaciously to the fact that indeed there is truth. The Democratic Party in 2008, in its party platform, referred to God but one time. 4 years later, there was no reference to God, and after significant heat, there was a change in the approach of that party. But I want to suggest to you that where God is not present, as he was for our founding fathers, necessarily tyranny results. Necessarily. And I'd like to suggest to you this morning that we're facing a twofold enemy, multiple, but I'd like to suggest to you that Marxism is indeed stands upon the shoulders of Darwinism. The justification for Marxism, the historical justification, a big theological word is cosmogony there, the very beginning of things. That justification, Marxism, relies upon Darwinism for its life. And here in my first edition of the Darwinian Origin of Species, Darwin makes it clear that what is right is might, tooth and talon. And I suggest to you it is at this point that Marxism, Black Lives Matter, Marxism in its varied forms, loses the moral right to speak. If might is right, then slavery cannot be wrong. As Fyodor Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, everything is permissible. If there is no God, might is right, tooth and talon prevails. And so it was that in our judiciary, as Darwinism made its way through our nation, we see that the legal field began to pick up on that. And this man, Christopher Columbus Langdell, was appointed in 1817 to reconstruct the very way that the judicial branch functioned. He had enormous success, and even Republicans like Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes proclaimed, we are under a constitution, but the constitution is what the judges say it is. Remarkable how that because of what was going on in our law schools, now our judges have elevated themselves to a place that was never intended by our founding fathers. Justice Hugo Black, in the middle part of the 20th century, accelerated and gave justification to this movement. Particularly in 1947, states' rights were revoked to a large degree. 1962, student prayer was removed. 63, Bible reading. 1980, the Ten Commandments. 85, benedictions and invocations. And then also in 2015, same-sex marriage was approved. Why? With this increased movement in the judiciary, there is enslavement that is increasingly coming upon our nation, and it is the judiciary that has set itself up as the final judge. We must understand, and I must move very quickly this morning to make it through this, that the judiciary was intended by our founding fathers to be the weakest branch. The executive, the second weakest, but the strongest branch was to be we the people. We the people. And here Mr. Madison, who is regarded as the architect or the father of the Constitution, writes in the 78th Federalist paper, he writes, "The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. And yet today, we have heard throughout the entire 20th century that the three branches of government are co-equal. The founding fathers never understood it so. It's important for the church in many respects to find its voice as we begin to find our bearings in these matters, and for us to begin to speak up to these issues. May God give us grace to stand in these days. We find that even in the presidency, President of Princeton, President also of our nation, Woodrow Wilson, in his book, New Freedom, said that government is not a machine but a living thing and is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. This was a complete shift away from America's understanding of government. And we failed to hold a president accountable. I'd like to call your attention very quickly to just some very important documents as I move through this today, and I know that this is one of the problems in dealing with historians. You begin to deal with details, and that becomes problematic for many of us that do not have facility with dates and other concepts, so please forgive me. The first important document that came out of the First Continental Congress was the Continental Association. There are 4 subsequent documents that are called organic documents. No state, no other laws may contravene, may go against these 4 organic documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance, the United States Constitution. I'm going to particularly call upon the Continental Association, the Declaration, and also the Northwest Ordinance. Just 3 of those this morning as we move forward. First of all, I call your attention to the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and pluck from that paragraph these expressions: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable and inalienable, it is interchangeable, unalienable rights, that among these are," notice the first, "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." I digress for just a moment and ask you this question: if the government will not protect the first of these rights, do you suppose that it will protect your 401k? That's the reason that the founding fathers identify the most important. Notice, from this arises this basic concept of the divine origin of freedom. The reason that no political party in America can truly be American, no individual in America can truly be American, unless there is a foundation upon theism, the belief in God, is seen here in this second paragraph. There is a Creator, and we see that the argument from the first paragraph is that there is the laws of nature, and what? Nature's God. It is parallel thought. It is an allusion not only to natural theology, natural revelation, but it is an allusion also to revealed revelation, the laws of God. And here the founding fathers took their stand. They said, from the Creator, we are given these basic rights. Again, I call your attention to the text for just a moment as we quickly move on. And that is that they never believed that these 3 rights were all of the rights that we possessed. That's the reason, years later, they will expect a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. do you see that among these are what? Life, liberty, and according to John Locke, the pursuit of happiness or property. Prayer. At the First Continental Congress, we're told that our founding fathers were deists. Nothing can be further from the truth. It's been said so many times that we've come to believe that. But this prayer at the First Continental Congress, and I trust that this makes some sense to you. I encourage our students in America's founding fathers to hold on to this idea of religion, because it is a general term that the founding fathers used to apply to the various denominations of Christendom. And this is an explanation of what happened when the request for prayer to begin Congress with prayer was presented by the father of the American Revolution, Samuel Adams. Notice Mr. John Jay and Mr. Rutledge protest. And this is Mr. John Adams that is writing to his wife. Notice the context. It's very important that you understand he uses this term religious or religion here. And notice the association. He's speaking of Episcopalians, Quakers, Anabaptists, and Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists. The reason that is important to us is because they didn't want to have prayer because they knew that there was such strong divisions. I don't have time to digress any further except to say that it's sad when we cannot work together as believers to move forward the cause of Jesus Christ. I'm thankful that Samuel Adams said he was no bigot and he was willing to hear prayers read even though he wasn't an Anglican. He suggested an Episcopalian. And Jacob Duché read prayers the next morning. And John Adams wrote to his wife what a tremendous outpouring of God's Spirit came upon that Second Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress, The faith of the first federal document also. Call your attention to that document that I've already identified, and that is the Continental Association. Notice as they write to King George, they identify themselves as what? As the free Protestant colonies. All of them were there except Georgia. They all made sure that their colony was interlineated as they closed that letter. They called themselves the free Protestant colonies. They were not afraid of their faith. Study the charters, study the state constitutions, and you will find that they're not ashamed of their faith. One of the other organic documents, the Northwest Ordinance, was composed so that our founding fathers would be able to determine how to settle the land that they called the Northwest. And that's these, today, what we would call Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The first article, the third article of the Northwest Ordinance was religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Our founding fathers said that as we go forward, we need to understand that our faith must go with us. Ohio complied with that as they composed their Constitution, their 1802 Constitution, religion, morality, and knowledge being essentially necessary to the good government and happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of instruction shall forever be encouraged. Understand that the Northwest Ordinance is an organic document. I wonder why our judges have been allowed to make rulings against an organic document. If you're in jurisprudence, I'd like to hear that. If you wouldn't mind engaging me following the service, I'd be happy to listen to that. But I believe with all of my heart, years ago, we should have brought these judges up on impeachment charges. And yet the Supreme Court recognized that it was valid to use the constitutions, these charters, to demonstrate that there was indeed a Christian founding in our nation. Here, Justice David Brewer writes in an 1892 decision, he said, "We examine the constitutions of the various states. We find in them a constant recognition of religious obligations. Every constitution of every one of the 44 states," in 1892. And then he concludes his decision with this: "These," that is, nearly 80 pieces of evidence, "these and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation." That's the Supreme Court recognizing states and the influence of our faith. Our states were saying that indeed our rights were based upon our faith. Here, Benjamin Franklin, in writing in France to Frenchmen, explained the climate of America. He said, "Bad examples to youth are more rare in America. Atheism is unknown there. Infidelity or deism rare and secret, so that persons may live to a great age in that country without having their piety or Christian scruples shocked by meeting either an atheist or an infidel." And yet today, professors in our universities tell us that all of our founding fathers were deists and irreligious. Benjamin Franklin refutes that, and I provide the reference for that. Christianity provided our independence. According to John Adams, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Immediately following the construction of the Bill of Rights in 1789, this man, who had been part of the Committees of Correspondence or the Spy Network of America, was a lawyer, a president of the Continental Congress, would become the first president of the American Bible Society, would write his Age of Revelation in response to Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. And there in the records, the debates, the proceedings of Congress, we read concerning this resolution that was raised by Elias Boudinot. Mr. Boudinot asks that both houses, House of Representatives as well as the Senate, send a request, a resolution to the new president, President Washington, and ask him to issue a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. Just a little over a week later, George Washington responds, and he says, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits." This is our Christian heritage. Our first president, soon after the Bill of Rights was composed and before it was finally sent out to the states, he said, "It is our obligation to recognize the hand of God and to express our appreciation." He obligated just not our nation, but he obligated the entire world, all people. Thomas Jefferson brings it together in his notes on Virginia. He brings it together very succinctly. Concerning our rights, the conviction must arise within us, be settled within us, that inalienable rights are rights that are gifts given to us by God. Gifts that I cannot give away, and gifts which cannot be taken from me, as Pastor James said one Sunday morning. Here Mr. Jefferson writes, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Notice a second point this morning. Not only the divine origin of our freedom, but the human organization of freedom, according to our founding fathers. They insisted that the most fundamental rights are given to us not by government, they're given to us by God. And they identified three here in the Declaration of Independence. They continue on to discuss why human governments exist. That to secure these rights, the God-given rights, governments are instituted among men. That is, governments are to help individuals secure those gifts more firmly, to enjoy them more deeply, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Our founding fathers lived a considerable period of their lives under a form of government that was structured like this. But they believed that government must come from the governed. Here you can clearly see that if an individual or small group of individuals becomes morally compromised or compromised in some other way, those that are above them in the various social stratas must also be adversely affected. Our founding fathers turned to Scripture. And that's the reason our Congress sought to purchase 20,000 copies of the Bible, and sought to ensure that it was subsequently printed in the Aiken Bible. Notice biblical republicanism, passages such as Exodus 18:21. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. That is a representative form of government. Our founding fathers didn't believe that they were establishing a democracy. They believed that that was a volcano where 51% could change the government today and every day. But rather, they believed in an inverted form of government so that the individual gave rise to government. And here in Isaiah 33:22, a passage to which they would have turned, and there are others such as John Adams and George Washington and others that tell us, though it's not in the Constitution, they tell us that they obtained the principles for the Constitution out of God's Word. Here, Isaiah 33:22, the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. These three branches come out of a representative form of government originating from the people themselves. Our president, just before the final vote and final establishment of our national government, he understood how important it was for America, any nation, to be moral. And he identifies the fact that the various branches of government will only stand as long as there is what? A virtuous body of the people. Only when there are right principles can there be right government that percolates not downward but upward. Those inalienable rights or unalienable rights are given to us not only in the Declaration, but also in the Constitution, particularly there in the Bill of Rights. In 1776, the Declaration, as I've already pointed out, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in 1789, when Congress that year sends 12 amendments out to the Constitution, this becomes the Bill of Rights, and those colonies send back 10. And finally, 10 become ratified and become part of the Bill of Rights. How did we come up with lists like this, such as self-protection? Those ideas are biblical, and we turn to individuals primarily that influenced the ideas of unalienable rights coming from John Locke. I know this is where historians become very tedious, but one of the most important works, and still remains a very important work, are his two treatises on government. The first treatise is a denial of the monarchy, ruling through monarchs. There are more than 1,300 biblical passages that Mr. Locke uses to deny the monarchy. His second uses more than 300. Together, these biblical passages add up to nearly 1,500 biblical references for establishing what? Human government. And it is individuals such as Richard Henry Lee who says that Mr. Jefferson drew entirely upon Mr. Locke, but there was a preacher also involved, one of 4 preachers that were leading voices in America. His name was John Wise. He was not alive at the time of the American Revolution. He had already exercised his ministry, his life, given it fully for the cause of Christ. And the founders began to reprint his sermons because they dealt with issues of taxation. They dealt with the same issues that they were facing, and they sent his sermons out. And the founders said, I see, we remember now these biblical passages. I sat in a gubernatorial discussion with a governor in the last election here in Tennessee, and that gubernatorial candidate was in a room with just a handful of ministers. I had been invited, and it occurred to me as we were going around, it occurred to me that I wondered if indeed our nation could experience the same kind of positive revolution for good as we experienced during the American Revolution. Having spent many years in academia and knowing where our seminaries and institutions of this nature were, I understood that indeed it was very unlikely. Why? Because men like John Wise truly believed what God's Word said. And it was true for many others, many of his peers. May God give us men, individuals today who understand that importance. I want to call your attention to something. Most of us are unfamiliar with the fact that I confess to you that I've failed to provide a slide here I think would be very helpful, and that is something that Dr. Land has already identified, and that is the fact that what changed our nation in the early part of the 18th century, the early part of the 1700s, was the spiritual awakening that began in Congregationalism and just spread throughout the nation. That allowed us, there were 3 groups that primarily started the Sunday school movement at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, and that was the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians. But notice with me here, would like to call your attention to the state constitutions for just a moment. The first two kept their constitutions, their form of government, there in Connecticut from 1639 to 1618, well after the Revolution. They said, we have a form of government that we're going to hold on to. They did the same thing there in Rhode Island, well, almost into the middle part of the 19th century. But there were others that devised constitutions. Notice New Hampshire, state churches also continued as they moved into the Constitution. As I indicate here, there were two states that developed constitutions before Congress asked all of the states to develop their own constitutions. The May 15th date is when the Continental Congress said, we all need to have something that can guide our government in our respective states. And as a result, many of these have, 7 of these 11 constitutions have bills of rights. That's an influence from the Great Awakening. I'll call your attention to it in just a moment. The rest of these constitutions I've given the dates for, but I hope that the historical significance will be very plain to you as I call your attention to these 3 items that arise out of all 11 constitutions. I suggest to you that the first, the right of conscience and religious freedom, is what arises in these constitutions because of the influence of the grace of God in the Great Awakening. They're realizing that Christians need to be Christian. Notice, at the federal level, the Northwest Ordinance is the first to offer a Bill of Rights. And here's the first article. No person demeaning himself in a peaceable and orderly manner shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments in the said territory. It will be a couple more years. It's first given in 87. A couple more years, it will be reaffirmed as those 5 states are settled. Notice what Benjamin Franklin had to say. As things begin to change in America, he said, and the divine being seems to have manifested his approbation, his approval of the mutual forbearance and kindness with which the different sects or Christian denominations treat each other, by the remarkable prosperity with which he has been pleased to favor the whole country. Our founding fathers were the ones that initiated this idea of American exceptionalism. They were saying God is doing something special in this new land, in this new world. As I conclude today, there's much more that could be and should be said. But I suggest to you that billboards that suggest that you can be an atheist and still be an American is a confession of historical ignorance. It's not possible to imbibe the spirit of our founding fathers, because our founding fathers said that you have to recognize that the first rights are not given to you by the government. The first rights are given to you by the one who has created you. And those rights cannot be taken from you. Most of us are aware that there is a portion of that second paragraph that I conclude with. Our founding fathers believed that the right to revolution was religious. It came out of this idea that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, that is, ensuring that God's rights granted to you are encouraged and nurtured, whenever that becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. Most of us are aware of the anecdote of after an enormous struggle of months, it seemed that the Constitutional Convention was going to break up, and then about halfway through, they decided, as members began to leave, that they needed to go to church. They took a break, and for a few days, they nurtured themselves spiritually. And when they came back, they found that that spiritual nourishment enabled them to complete what they believed they had to do. Finally, when Mr. Franklin was leaving the convention, he was approached by Mrs. Powell. Most of us know the story. She began to ask him questions. She asked him what form of government the convention had given. And for those of us who know the answer, would you help me? He said, a republic, if, help me, you can keep it. If you can keep it. It's not by our human strength. And what I've appreciated most has been Dr. Land and my pastor saying it's not government that's going to reform America, it's the people of God. I've appreciated that the most. I'm thankful for those men, those women that understood that it is the finger of God that controls the destiny of nations. May God give us grace to submit to His highest willingness for our hearts and lives. Thank you. The Lord bless you.